Hello everyone, welcome to Quirky Port. I'm Janet Bolitho. We begin our explorations of the quirkiness of port. On behalf of the Council, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the people of the Kulin Nations. Pay my respects to their elders past and present, acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. Let's begin. With Quirky Port. The thing about quirky, it suggests a curve rather than a straight line. And this small mosaic from the Port Melbourne foreshore seemed to express the intent of the quirkiness of port. The blue and the red, the port colours, which recur as a theme throughout Port Melbourne's history, still crop up in its present. Recently, I had the opportunity to walk South Melbourne's streets with the former Councillor of South Melbourne and Mayor, Reg Macy, and he told me how after school, when he was a boy, his grandmother had walked the streets of South Melbourne, pointing out details to him, introducing him to stories of the early days of settlement. And she said to him, "Sonny, you must look up," as in this weather vane here we see in the backyard of Duggar Beasley's house. Look down at the details in the footpath and the history that's to be revealed. And I admire this particular sewer access cover in Beacon Cove with this beautiful tree, but every footpath in Port Melbourne has got cues to the past in access covers like this. It's the world beneath your feet as well as the world above. But in addition, you want to look far and with curiosity as this man is doing this public artwork in Dow Street, Port Melbourne. And looking for the detail as well. I love the cuff and the buttons on this statue. But the quirkiness of it lies in the fact we don't know what he's looking for or what he's looking at. So there's something about mystery as well as curiosity that lies in the quirkiness of port. We begin our exploration down at the foreshore at Lagoon Pier on a glorious autumn afternoon. There's something about Lagoon Pier. It's got this curve at the end which gives it its particular character, as well as these lower landings where young people like to hang out and dive off in the summer months. But there's something also about the scale of Lagoon Pier. It's not grand, it's quite intimate, it's quite narrow. As you can see, it can comfortably fit 2 people abreast, but probably no more. So you have to squeeze past the fishermen and inquire as to whether they've caught anything today. And the answer is so often no, but they patiently fish all the same. So we're going to follow a bit of a lagoon thread in this walk and talk. So I'd like to introduce you to the former Sandridge Lagoon, which ran from the foreshore right up to the north of Port Melbourne at Ingalls Street. And as you can see, the lagoon was long and thin and tapering, and its presence can still be felt in Port Melbourne today. In the street layout, So how is it possible, I thought when first moving to Port Melbourne, that Esplanade West didn't run along the foreshore but instead ran inland? And it took me several years to learn that Esplanade West and Esplanade East mark the shores of the former Sandridge Lagoon. And even today, those roads have an eccentric shape that is not the kind of grid pattern you see in many other suburbs of Melbourne. And being on the lagoon or near the former lagoon, peek into the backyard of Doug Beasley, whose family fished on the lagoon for generations. Doug has retreated into the yard now, but if you look through the gate, you can see that he's got a boat in for the winter. So these double-ender boats return to his yard every winter, but like migratory shorebirds, for their annual clean and paint. And it's this beautiful working boatyard that is just such an amazing continuing presence in Port Melbourne today. Continuing walking along Esplanade West, we come across this house built in the interwar years, and as you can see, it's looking terribly run down and shabby, obviously not long for this life, a bit like an older person showing signs of its age. But this house reveals the story of the former lagoon and how housing was built here once the lagoon had been completely filled. Just a little bit further on, we come to this curious where two roads meet, Esplanade West and Lyons Street. And this is a particularly intriguing backyard. So tiny, so small, and yet in that yard is a fig tree, an olive tree and a lemon tree, suggesting the Greek heritage of the owners. But when you look on the map of the Sandridge Lagoon again, I've highlighted that pointy section, which is just that how the roads were shaped by the former lagoon. And just over the road, a pair of shops, modest shops. The one on the right is like a museum piece. It's a tailor's shop, a Greek tailor, and in the window you may be able to dimly see the suit fabric beautifully folded and laid out. And in the window at present there's an overcoat, but it's as if the tailor has just left the shop, which I think he may well have done, may have passed on by now. But this shop so perfectly represents the presence of the large Greek community that once lived in Port Melbourne. But you'll also notice, if you look towards the centre of the picture, how the shops sag. They're sinking back into the lagoon. And looking up, you see the verandas, the former city of Port Melbourne. And looking at that council, bearing the council crest, and looking at the crest, starting in the top left-hand corner and going clockwise, the beehive, which I believe was a symbol of prosperity, the wool bale, which made Victoria rich, the anchor, very Port Melbourne feature, and the kangaroo. So these verandas are found, in surprising spots throughout Port Melbourne and indicate the growing capacity, I suppose, of the city of Port Melbourne in the later days of the 19th century to add and embellish their infrastructure. And so now we turn into Bay Street, and enter the section near where Coles is, and amazingly, where Brumbies is, where you can buy your bread, if you look up there, these amazing, beautiful stained glass window details that were added to the late Victorian shops at the turn of the 20th century. And here's another example. The shops between Liardish and Graham Street have a particular character, and they also have these beautiful copper-edged windows. And we're fortunate indeed to have a shopping strip that is so particular, so distinctive. Continuing along Bay Street, come to the former Sandridge Post Office, now the home of Albert Park College Environment and Arts Hub. And I so admire the circular, I suppose it was a window once, the brickwork, the intricacy of that brickwork, you know, getting everything so perfectly aligned to create that circle. And the brick here absorbs the late afternoon sunlight and turns these bricks into a most gorgeous honey colour. And the colour of the bricks is unusual and reveals that this is a very early building. This was made, I think it would have been made from local brick rather than brick sourced further afield. Crossing to the foreshore now, more brickwork, polychrome brickwork from the turn of the 20th century. And there's something about a sign that is fading. It's not a ghost sign yet, but a sign that is fading. And this toilet block reveals in a way how very, very busy the Port Melbourne foreshore has always been historically into the present and into the present. Visiting warships, migrant ships, the Port Melbourne foreshore has always attracted lots of visitors, and visitors require facilities, even though this one is so modest. And it records in this writing a very tangible reminder of how many Greek and Italian migrants there were through Port Melbourne in the post-war years. And continuing down the path to this little rotunda, and in port there's always a ship on the horizon coming and going and connecting port in a way to the rest of the world. But it's becoming harder and harder to tell that Port Melbourne has only relatively recently made a transition from a working people's port place to the more prosperous suburb that it is today, that people made their living working on the piers and the wharves. And there's very little record of that to be found in Port Melbourne. So it's very touching to enter that rotunda and find on the pier timbers these little memorials to former painters and dockers and wharfies who have chosen to have their lives recorded here in this place, revealing their deep attachment to Port Melbourne. And just the names, you know, in Port Melbourne it was so common to give everybody a nickname, and these are just two examples. But it's not only painters and dockers and wharfies who are represented here. Migrants who arrived at Station or Prince's Pier have also chosen to mark their lives on the edge of this modest rotunda. So whereas we have lots of debate these days about the appropriate memorialisation of events and themes, this rotunda is actually like a very spontaneous expression of people's place attachment to Port Melbourne. And lest I've given you the impression that the sun always shines in Port Melbourne, in fact the weather often comes from the south and it's cold, wet and grey. But even the grey gives Port its particular character. And I love this picture of the beacon emerging from the fog with all else, the port, the pier, all obscured. But the beacon, which is such an identification, a marker for Port's identity, stands proud and clear with its red tip. The beacon expressing the alignment of the shipping channel, but also giving that same alignment to the layout of the Beacon Cove estate. Now we wander back inland, and one of the characteristics of Port that makes it so interesting is the variety of housing from different periods, different eras. So here we have very old, very plain, very modest house. Next, we have this probably early 20th century pier, and David Radcliffe in his book about Port Melbourne finds all sorts of cues and interest if you look up above the parapet of these houses. And I love the pairs and the triplets of terraced housing you find in Port Melbourne, which often bear the name of the builders' wives or sisters or children, and make them particularly interesting. So Thelma and Carmel are such a pair, as well as the detail above the veranda and the polychrome brick. We have the surprising, to some, bank houses built between 1928 and 1948, which import this English garden city model into Port Melbourne to, at that time, create affordable housing for workers. And this particular house is barely altered apart from the veranda being filled in, and retains an original fence. And many people are quite surprised when they stumble on this very intact estate in Port Melbourne. Then we have a house, a very characteristic house once in Port Melbourne. This house probably replaced a Victorian house and built in the 60s or 70s. And these houses are very fast disappearing from Port as their large blocks and lack of heritage protection mean that they make way for new development. And then we find the pubs. Was there a pub on every corner? Pat Granger, the author of Chartered Scoundrels, chastens us that that's not quite the case, but nevertheless pubs were very prevalent on Port's corners, and some of them, like this one, Swallows on Ingle Street, were extensively remodelled in the Art Deco period, and as you can see, beautifully looked after by the current owners. And you'll see at the bottom left-hand corner that deco, very distinctive deco detail of the arrow denoting progress of the era. And this pub has fortunately survived and thrived, unlike other pubs that underwent similar change in the Art Deco period, such as the London Hotel. And we're fortunate in Port that many former corner shops survive, even though they're now residences rather than shops. But they indicate how each sort of mini micro neighbourhood was served by a shop that supplied virtually everything you needed. And this one is particularly intact on the corner of Farrell and Clark Street. And here is another example of a corner shop. This was once Daimler's bootmakers, but in this picture are to be seen many elements. In the foreground, a horse trough, just reminding us that this was once an extremely busy intersection for freight, and how freight horses would have stopped here. Freight horses that pulled the drays would have stopped here to load and unload material into the railway's sidings to the left. And the stone walls that you can see there are such a distinctive and quirky feature of Port. They were built by Jack Gould, a council worker, and his team, and they divide Port Melbourne's railway reserves into very discrete and identifiable sections, all of them named after former mayors of the municipality. So this is a very nice fading sign of Turner Reserve. Les Turner was a mayor, and he was a plumber, and he too was given a nickname, Les Leaky Turner, he was referred to, not very respectfully. But some of these signs have been souvenired, including the one at Fennell Reserve, and so it would be very nice to see them reinstated because they give character to each of Port Melbourne's railway reserves. And in Port Melbourne, this particular feature that we're so close to the city and yet we're so far away. And here with Gould's stone wall again in the foreground, but looking at that high density along South Bank, and we're related to it but separate from it, and this is a very particular Port characteristic, I think. Now it's the details, you know. Jane Jacobs, the great urbanist and activist, she was very much in favour of streets that were dense with interest and detail. And here's one example. Swallow that denotes the presence of the former Swallow and Ariel biscuit factory. And as well as being a charming object in its own right, it's as if you just press that swallow to release the smells that were associated with the biscuit factory, the ginger nuts and the other sweet biscuits. So much of Port's history is associated with its smell history, the smell of the tip, the smell of Dunlop's rubber tyres, the smell of cooking tomatoes at Tom Piper's, the acrid smell of the boiling fat at Lever and Kitchen. And so just this symbol is a cue to all that. But in the streets, people incorporate beautiful details into their own homes, such as this front door with the penguins, a very lovely feature. And then on public land, people also, here we see two gates, one contemporary on the left and an older one on the right. And both these gates are perfect examples of what the city of Port Phillip tries to achieve in encouraging gates that perform a function to keep people in and out, but also to be open and transparent so that people can see through them and people don't barricade themselves behind fixed high walls. And it enables you to see things like the cat on the mat and other delightful details. And here I spotted in the arms of a willow myrtle tree a little free library, obviously tailor-made bespoke for this particular tree, and the handles are made of owls, which are associated with bookshops. And the fun that people have brought to creating this letterbox out of an old emergency sprinkler box, and added the plate, boîte aux lettres. And no talk about port would be complete without including dogs, because dogs are companions to many people in port. And this sculpture by Henry Smith, Man, Dog and Boat, it's just alive with the curiosity of Port's dogs out for their daily exploration. But something that's puzzling about this sculpture is that the person is actually rowing the boat the wrong way, with the flat end of the boat, rather than, I should know my boating terminology, but he should be rowing the way where the dog is. But anyway, the question is, was this intentional? Is it a metaphor of some kind? Does it mean anything? Or did the artist simply, like me, not fully understand boats? And then there's this curious sign outside the Port Melbourne football ground forbidding the presence of dogs and cats. Now, both the dog and the cat look expectant, as though they would like to gain such access. And once again, it's a cue into a story which I don't fully understand, about the historical rivalry between Port Melbourne and Williamstown, the Seagulls, and their respective presidents' challenges over the right of their dogs to walk on the football oval. Now, on the foreshore, in around 2000, you'll find all sorts of fragments of text which relate to a project called Memories, Margins and Markers. And it responded to the sense people at Port Melbourne were feeling at that time, that their old world was disappearing before their eyes, and about feeling that they were to be overwhelmed by the new. And the artists interviewed many older residents who came up with many beautiful stories from which these fragments were taken. But there was something about this one that caught my eye, because how often, although we no longer write letters, it's got that sentiment when you say to someone, don't forget to write, while almost knowing that they will. So there's something, very longing and nostalgic about that. And I felt that way in doing this walk around the quirky elements of port, that many of them are disappearing, and so many of them are to do with our heritage. Things become more quirky as they get older, as they acquire a patina, the layer of years, attain a bit of a sense of mystery when you're not quite sure what they mean. And so I think it's very important that we continue to, a lot of these elements are not, strictly speaking, things that you could protect by means of a planning policy or similar, because many of them are of an ephemeral nature and they're character-filled rather than objects of great heritage value. So I think it requires a more sort of subtle and nuanced approach from us to appreciate the role that quirky details and elements make in the interest and character of our neighbourhoods. And further, we looked at the names of Turner There are many other street names, every street has a name, but the only place that I'm aware of in Port Melbourne that bears a name in the Bunwurrung language is the Family and Children's Centre in Liardet Street, Babak Womanjika. And doesn't that name just have a lift to it? Babak meaning children, Womanjika meaning welcome. And so these beautiful phrases from the Bunwurrung language, we hope we will see greater representation of in years to come. And in Port Melbourne, the house on the left was one of Port Melbourne's very earliest houses, virtually on the shores of the lagoon. And it's showing its age, it's gone now, very run down, not habitable really, not by contemporary standards. And so it was quite right, I suppose, that the house had to be demolished. But then in its place is this large 3-storey development. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with that particular development, but just to reflect on how we tell the stories of the place through our housing and our streetscapes. So when that former house was there, you could tell Port Melbourne's history through it. Whereas now with the new house, it's very difficult to read that history. And similarly with the Greek and Italian houses that were built, very soon none of them will remain. And how will we even know that Port Melbourne was once a place that had its second language was Greek? There was such a large representation of Greek people here. So these were interesting reflections that occurred to me in preparing this talk as we look to the streets and how the streets speak to us of our history. But on a concluding note, a bit further up Esplanade West, one of the interwar Californian bungalow houses has been demolished, but in its place is a new house made of a blonde brick, not dissimilar in colour to the Sandridge post office, and on its front door has been etched the form of the Lagoon Pier with which we began this walk. So I love to see that this new owner of a new house has chosen to represent this very special symbol of Port Melbourne on their front door. So I'd like to finish there and thank you very much.